You are looking at two tower clock movements made by the Self-Winding Clock Company and the Self-Winding Clock Company master clock that controls them. Both tower movements are wired directly to the master clock. Both of these movements are slave clocks. Neither has timekeeping capability like a traditional tower clock movement, and therefore they can be much smaller because they do not have an escapement, a pendulum, or weights. These movements simply have motors that move the hands forward 1/2 minute and then stop. The motors are turned on every 30 seconds by an accurate master clock. The master clock is the timekeeper. The tower clock movements are mounted on two separate platforms. In order to display both movements but have just one dial, the movements are connected with sprockets and a chain. That way either one can be selected to drive the set of hands mounted on the glass window. This is what it looks like from inside my office. My goal was to have an operating tower clock with hands and a dial that are visible from the office but do not obscure the view of the shop. The Self-Winding Clock Company began installing synchronized clock systems as early as the 1880s. They chose the 1893 Chicago World's Fair to promote their advanced technology in electromechanical clock systems. They installed a spectacular clock system of over 200 clocks, highlighted by a 150-foot tower with 4 7-foot dials. These are all controlled by one Self-Winding Clock Company master clock. This is the World's Fair tower clock movement. It was at the time a modern marvel, for it had no pendulum, weights, or an escapement. The hands were driven by an electric motor, and the motor was turned on by a master clock. This is the small tower movement before restoration. This small tower movement at one time had been converted to run on 110-volt AC current. An additional partial tower movement was located with the original vibrator movement that was used in the restoration. The large tower movement had more serious problems. When obtained, this dirty and rusty movement was missing the original drive motor and timing mechanism to control the duration of the motor run. Fortunately, it did come with the cluster gears to drive 4 sets of hands and slave coils to receive a timing signal from the master clock. The 1908 Self-Winding Clock Company catalog extols the virtues of their tower clock movements. They didn't weigh thousands of pounds or need a large amount of space, and most importantly, they did not require constant attention. The catalog showed 4 different movements capable of operating dials from 24 to 144 inches. Self-Winding Clock Company tower movements have a motor that turns a worm drive a scheduled number of revolutions to move the hands 1/2 minute and then stops. The master clock starts the motor every 30 seconds. As restored, this tower movement with a cluster of gears is capable of operating a clock with 4 dials up to 36 inches in diameter. Arrows point to beautifully designed electrical components that are used instead of an escapement, pendulum, and weights. The movement is now complete and fully operational. With these electromechanical tower clocks running, there's not much to see. With no pendulum or escapement, the only motion is the motor turning the gears to move the hands each 1/2 minute. This larger tower clock had bigger problems, but is now restored and in operation. The arrows point to the electrical components that move the hands 1/2 minute and then wait for the next pulse to start the action again. It was calculated it'll take 24 revolutions of the worm drive to turn the clock hands 1/2 minute. A replacement motor that runs on 12 volts DC was selected, and the timing disc was fabricated out of phenolic. On this tower movement, more happens. Here you will see the tower motor turned on by an electrical pulse from the master clock. The pulse energizes the slave coils, which turn into a magnet attracting the arm that turns on the motor switch. The timing disc rotates long enough to move the hands 1/2 minute and the switch is released. This takes about 15 seconds. The master clock starts this with an electrical pulse every 30 seconds. So now you've seen these two tower movements in action. They're about 100 years old and are testimony to the ingenuity of the self-winding clock company of New York. For an electromechanical clock collector, these tower movements are a true rarity. Interestingly, they also seem to be a rarity among tower clock experts. If anyone has any information about the self-winding clock company tower clocks, I would love to hear from you. Thank you for watching.